I say what a real privilege it is to be speaking here in the Royal Institution. 211 years of history, discovery, learning, educating people. I was once a university lecturer, and I know that universities and institutions of learning stand for objectivity, impartiality, the disinterested pursuit of truth, the pursuit of knowledge, rationality, everything you've got to leave behind yourself when you go into politics. I'm also aware that a lot of people think that politics is today too small to deal with the big issues. I think a lot of people also feel, like Shelley said about his mother-in-law, that we've lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. And perhaps some of you feel like Keynes felt about politicians when he said it was the survival of the unfittest. But I want to talk this evening about some of the big issues that concern me. I want to talk about what happened during the global financial crisis. I want to suggest there are a number of lessons that we can learn. And I want to also suggest that there are things that we've got to do now, immediately, urgently, not just as a national community, but as a world community. You know, I was in Washington a year or two ago, and there was a huge group of demonstrators who were outside the International Monetary Fund building. And I walked across and I looked at these demonstrators and the banners, and one banner really struck me. It said, "Worldwide Campaign Against Globalization." It was a bit like the French anti-globalizers campaign in 2009, which said no to 2010. But it got me thinking about what are the issues that we have got to deal with. The pace and the speed and the scope of global change has made millions of people more prosperous. It's given people more opportunities than they could ever have dreamed of before. It's increased, in most countries at least, people's life expectancy. It's made it possible for people to benefit from technological change. It's cut by half in only the last 10 or 15 years the price of technical computers and other goods like that. It's cut by half the price of clothes that people get because of their production in a mass way in China and Asia. But there's really four problems that the global changes that we face raise for all of us. And four problems that, if they are not dealt with, leave the world unable to plan and chart its future. Four problems that I think we're going to have to deal with, and I want to talk about them over the next few weeks. The first is, of course, the environment. That globalization has revealed the problems that we face with climate change, with pollution, and how we must act if we're going to avoid, in many countries, particularly island countries, climate change refugees, climate change evacuees. And I want to deal with that in another talk that I'll give during the course of the next few weeks. The second problem is obviously inequality and poverty, because we know that while the vast majority of people have benefited from the global changes we've seen, it's also the case that at least 1 billion people are living on less than $1 a day. It's the case that 75 million children, you'd think in 2010 we could have done better, 75 million children are not going to school around the world. 1 in 8 mothers are dying in childbirth in Sierra Leone, and 500,000 mothers die unnecessarily in what should be the happiest moment of their life, becoming the saddest and tragic moment for their family. So we know that globalization has left with us a huge problem of inequality that always existed, but people are more aware of the consequences of what that means. And then the next problem that I think globalization raises with us is to whom we are responsible. Global change raises the question. The Treaty of Versailles said the self-determination of nations was the most important thing to safeguard. Now we know that we have a responsibility not just to securing the freedom of individual countries, and that is still a huge issue, but we've got a responsibility to people behind borders who may themselves be victims of torture or abuse, the denial of their human rights. And that struck me most forcibly when I read and talked about the story of what happened in Rwanda, where the world really did fail to come to the aid of 1 million people who eventually died. And it's most graphically and I think poignantly illustrated to me in the Rwanda Children's Museum. And if you go into the Rwanda Children's Museum, you see portraits of young children who were murdered, indeed tortured, during the Rwandan genocide. And there's one child whose portrait is up there for everybody to see, and it just gives a few basic details about his life. It says, name, David. It said, age, 10. It said, favorite sport, football. Favorite pastime, making people laugh. Ambition to be a doctor. Method of death, torture. Last words to his mother, the United Nations are coming. And they never did. And it's a huge dishonor to all of us that we failed and still fail to help people who behind borders are suffering the abuse of their human rights. But the fourth problem that globalization raises that we have still to solve is the one I want to talk about this evening. And Alistair Darling, Peter Mandelson, David Miliband are here, and we've all been dealing with this problem over the last few years. That globalization has shown us that there is an inherent problem about the financial stability of our economic system. And it's something that we have got to address. And if we do not address, then we will have further crises in the years to come. And I want to say something about what happened to us in Britain and what we saw happening around the world, and what the results of what we have learned show me what we've got to do. And I think we've learned one thing that is basically central to everything that we do, and it's that markets are dynamic, they lead to great entrepreneurship, people show that they've got immense flair, they bring out the greatest innovative qualities in people, they bring about consumer power, but at the same time, markets do need morals. Markets are built on values that they cannot themselves generate, but have to be generated by us. And you need trust, you need fairness, and you need responsibility if markets are going to flourish in the public interest. It all started for us, and particularly for Alistair Darling, who's here this evening, when we saw Northern Rock in trouble in 2007. And we then realized that what had been happening around the world was that lots of securities, subprime mortgages in particular, had been selling across the world, and half of these subprime products, which we found were later valueless, had been sold on from America to Europe. So far from the subprime problem being caught in America and something that you could isolate and insulate yourself against, half of all the subprime mortgages had been sold on to firms in Europe, and they did not understand the risks that they were taking. And so Northern Rock was collapsing. We had to take action to deal with that, and something then happened, something that certainly Alistair, Peter, Harriet, and all of us never thought would happen. We had to nationalize Northern Rock. It might have happened under Clement Attlee or under Hugh Gaitskell or under Harold Wilson, but it was happening under us. Northern Rock, let's just remember what happened there. Yeah. You see, even Tony Blair supported the nationalization of Northern Rock. And here's the reason why. His old football team, Newcastle United, which he supported, was now being sponsored by the United Kingdom government, Northern Rock. And if you went to America at that time, AIG, which is the company that the American government had to rescue, it was actually the shirt sponsor for Manchester United Football Club. So the world was changing pretty fast. And then in a quick succession of events, just remember the worry that people had, the anxiety that people had, and then what actually happened. We moved from a situation where one or two institutions were at risk to April 2008, when we took further action to help liquidity in the financial system. And then we moved right through to September, when Lehman Brothers collapsed. And what we found on that day was something that we hadn't really discovered before, that banks were so entangled with each other, they were so interrelated to each other, they were so dependent upon each other and the trade they did with each other, that the whole financial system was in danger of collapse. What had happened was, we'd thought that by having a whole range of different products and instruments, we were diversifying risk right across the world. What actually happened is that because banks and financial institutions were so entangled with each other and so interconnected, that the whole system was in danger of collapsing. And I went to America. I went to see what was happening in New York. I went to meet the President of America and talk about it. And I was coming back on the plane, having talked to Alistair, and coming back on the plane from Washington that night, and realizing that something quite fundamental had to be done, or the system would itself fall away. What Lehman Brothers had ensured from Lehman Brothers was that the system was really frozen. There was effectively a power cut in the financial system. It was like all the lights had gone out in your house and there was nothing that you could do about it, and there was no way that you could get the power going again. And I realized after talking to people that this was not simply a problem, as people told us, of liquidity. It was not simply a problem of cash flow for the banks, that there was a structural problem that had to be dealt with. I phoned up the chief executive of one of the major banks, and I said to him, I thought there was a big problem here. And he said, no, it's just a cash flow problem. All we need is overnight finance and everything will be okay. And the next day I found that this was one of the banks with the biggest debts ever in history, and one of the banks that was subject to collapse. And I think one banker summed it up when he said to Alistair, he said, we're now beginning to understand the risks that we've been taking. And I think that is a tale about what was happening. So what did we have to do? We had to decide to restructure the banking system. There was no point, in my view, in Britain doing it on its own if we could get other countries to work with us. So I phoned up and talked to all the different leaders of Europe, and I talked to President Bush in America. And I said, look, I think the problem is that we've got to recapitalize the banking system, that there's a structural problem here that's got to be dealt with. We cannot do it on our own, because if one country acts and another country doesn't, then we will still be in the same problem that we've got. And I couldn't at that time persuade other people that this was the problem, and I couldn't persuade other countries to act immediately. We decided on a Wednesday morning that we would act. And throughout that Tuesday night, we were trying to negotiate the terms under which we would act and terms under which we would restructure the banking system. I'd finally got to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then at 4 o'clock, the door in my bedroom creaked open, and I thought it was John, my son. I said, John, go back to bed. I'm really tired. And I got this sound, and this voice said, it's Shriti, and I've got a spreadsheet for you. And we were working out how we could recapitalize the bank. So we made the announcement that we would recapitalize our banks, we would restructure them away, we'd put £50 billion and lots of guarantees in as part of our restructuring of the system. We didn't know that morning whether other countries would come with us. We didn't know whether they would continue to see it as a different problem or see it as a problem as we had seen it. But by the end of the week, we were fortunate that almost every country recognized, every major financial center recognized what had to be done. If other countries had not acted, I don't believe that what we did in Britain could have been successful. If only one country had done it, then I believe there could have been still major problems in the financial system. But the fact that all of us acted together meant, in the end, that the restructuring of the banking system could start. Now, what are the lessons I learned about the financial system before I say what are the lessons I learned about how we run and manage the economy in the future? The lessons I learned about the financial system is that banks and financial institutions are now so interlinked, so interrelated, so entangled with each other, and so global. Probably the first and major global industry of all time, that unless you have global supervision rather than national supervision, you will not be able to see a financial system functioning smoothly. So yes, we could do a lot more in Britain, and yes, we've got huge lessons to learn in Britain, but the argument that I put in 1998 after the Asian crisis became even more relevant to me then, that you need a system of global supervision. You need big multinational banks supervised not just by 20, 30, 40 different national regulators, but they need supervised in a coherent system that involves global and international supervision. And unless you do that, unless you build a global supervisory system equivalent to the global financial flows that we're seeing, and global financial flows are the essence of globalization, like the global sourcing of goods. Unless you do that, then the system is in danger of collapsing again. And I think the second lesson I learned is that you've got to have more certainty about capital. Banks have got to be properly capitalized, and those that aren't are likely to collapse in the future. And we've got to ensure that the capital requirements on banks are sorted out as quickly as possible, because this is still an area of great uncertainty, and banks can justifiably say they don't know what the rules of the game are internationally. We've got to get an international agreement on capital for the banking system. If you think of a bank, its revenues are made up of the capital it uses, the remuneration to its executives, the dividend to its shareholders, and the tax that it pays. Now, something had happened over the last 20 years, and the balance between capital, remuneration, dividends, and what was paid as a contribution to society had gone wrong. So one figure has really struck me. In the 10 years before the financial crisis, in Britain alone, if we had paid our executives, our top executives of the banks, 10% less in remuneration, the total sum that would have been raised is £50 billion, exactly the amount of money that we had to put in to restructure the banking system and recapitalise it. So something had gone wrong in the relationship between capital, dividends, remuneration, and taxation. And so I'm convinced that we have got to have a tough line on remuneration, that we cannot allow a bonus system to reward irresponsible behaviour, that short-termism should be punished rather than given great privileges, and we need the Financial Services Authority in Britain, but all countries, all financial centres around the world, to impose a regime that is fair and responsible to reward long-term success rather than short-term behaviour. And we will not hesitate to give the Financial Services Authority the powers to quash executive bonuses if we feel that it's simply wrong for the financial system to encourage reckless and irresponsible behaviour. And then the other thing I've learned about the financial system is something has gone wrong about the relationship between different countries in the way that we manage the banking system. So it's pretty easy for banks to be registered in a whole series of different countries, and because it's a global economy, to choose the location of activity, and particularly for taxation purposes. And we've got a situation where, unless you have a global financial agreement about how you're going to tax the banking system, the lights did go out 2 years ago, but unless you have a global agreement about how you tax the financial system, then you will have all the problems about a race to the bottom. So here are the lessons. You've got to have global supervision. You've got to get capital in its right place, and there's got to be certainty about it. You've got to have a better system of remuneration, and at the same time, you've got to have a fair but global system of taxation that people cannot walk away from at will. Now, what's the economic lesson from these financial events that were really so difficult for all of us? The economic lesson to me is, if markets fail, then governments have a responsibility to intervene. We cannot anymore subscribe to an old orthodoxy that leave it to the markets themselves, and if something goes wrong, just pull away and let things sort themselves out. And my friend Alan Greenspan came to the conclusion himself, as a result of what he saw over that period, that the executives of the banks, as he said, he had thought would work in the shareholders' interest and then the public interest, but that's not actually what was happening. So governments have got a role to protect the public, as we protected the savings and deposits of those people who are members of the public, but we've also got a role to make sure the economy moves forward. J.K. Galbraith went to the 40th anniversary of the Austrian Republic's creation in 1985. And the famous economist went to speak to the Austrians about the success of the economy. And sitting in the front row as he addressed this great and distinguished audience about the 40th anniversary of the Austrian Republic was Friedrich von Hayek, von Mises, and some of the great Austrian right-wing economists who had pioneered some of the monetarist and other economic theories that are associated with the right of centre. And he said he owed Mr. Hayek and Mr. Mises a huge debt of gratitude, because if they hadn't left Austria in 1945, it could never have had a successful period of prosperity over the next 40 years. And what he was really saying was that where markets fail, governments have got to act. So what did we have to do around the world? We had to have a stimulus to the economy that is unparalleled in the history of world economics. A 2 trillion stimulus that was put into the economy by a succession of governments and in the end some international institutions to make sure that economic activity could be sustained first of all and then could grow again. And in Britain we did three particular things that I think are really important. First of all, we helped small businesses through the difficulties. When banks were not lending enough, we gave them time to pay, so about 200,000 businesses benefited from cash flow from the government. Secondly, we protected mortgage holders. Remember the 1990s, the mortgage repossessions that were at a record rate in the 1990s when recession hit us then. We gave an underpinning to the mortgage market so that people would not be thrown out of their homes. They could renegotiate their mortgages and they had greater legal protection. And the result is that mortgage repossessions are about a half, far less than that, in fact, of what they were in the 1990s. And thirdly, on jobs. We had a responsibility to help people who were facing redundancy and help people who were unemployed. And as a result of what we've done, by helping young people, by helping adults, by giving tax credits to people who are on part-time work, by giving some support to companies who are in difficulty, by investing in infrastructure to move that forward at a time when the economy was not doing well, we managed to help thousands of people avoid unemployment during this recession. So unemployment is half what it was in the 1990s on the claimant count, and unemployment is now falling in Britain as a result of government action to make sure that people can get work. Unemployment is still too high in our view, and that's why we want to bring it down. But if you remember that in the 1980s, even at the end of the recession, unemployment kept rising for 5 years. In the 1990s, even as the recession ended, unemployment kept rising for another 3 years. To have unemployment falling as we move back into growth is something that can only be done by an active government prepared to work on people's behalf and make sure they're in jobs. And that's the reason why we estimate that unemployment could have been about 1.5 million higher, less people in jobs, if we had followed the advice that was taken in the 1980s, and indeed similar advice to what was taken in the 1930s. Keynes in the 1920s put forward proposals to the British Treasury and tried to advise them that when unemployment is high, governments have got to do something to create aggregate demand in the economy. And I've seen in the Treasury Library the book that he gave to the Permanent Secretary of the Treasury at the time, How We Conquer Unemployment, that was what Keynes called it. And on the front page of it is marked by the Treasury Permanent Secretary only 3 words: inflation, extravagance, and bankruptcy. And that's what they thought of Keynes's proposal in the 1920s. And we have learned these lessons, and that is why we're doing the things that we've done. Now, that needed also the world to work together. And that's the other point I want to make. With us just intervening on our own, it could not have worked. We had to have other countries working with us. So to have the rest of Europe and America, and indeed all the developed world, injecting resources into the economy meant it was possible for us to recover from what was the biggest collapse of output and indeed of exports and trade since the 1930s. And today the issue is pretty clear. Do you continue this support for the economy until you're assured of recovery? Or do you, as some people argue, pull away that support now in the expectation that either everything is okay or it's wrong, that government should be acting anyway? And we've had a debate with our opponents right throughout this recession. At every point they've said, cut the government intervention, make sure that you cut public spending now. And we've had to argue, we are having to support the economy and will continue to support the economy until growth is assured. And I do warn people that if we decide that you pull billions of pounds out of the economy now, at a time when world growth is pretty fragile, when Europe is not growing very much at all, when the financial markets are still unstable in many, many respects, and trade is not really moving forward as it should, then we could face a double-dip recession, and I am not prepared to take that risk by pulling money out of the economy now. Can I say there is a third lesson that we've learned, and this is the last one I want to focus on before we have our discussion. It's that you need to recognize how the world is going to change in the next few years so that we can respond properly to it. I expect that the world economy will double in size over the next 15 to 20 years. I expect that the growth that's taking place in Asia and the number of millions, indeed 1 billion people joining what you might call the middle classes in Asia over the next 15 years will be not only a vast stimulus to growth and prosperity around the world, if we can solve these problems of financial instability, but it's a huge opportunity for Britain. To be here at the Royal Institution, we know our scientific expertise, we know our history of innovation, we know what we've done as a creative country, we know that we're the country that's won more Nobel Prizes in medicine and science per head of the population than any other country, and we know our record of creativity and innovation and invention is not simply the 19th century or the 20th century, it is the 21st century. And people then ask, why is it that government is taking such an interest in the industries and technologies of the future? Why is it that we are investing, for example, in low carbon so that we can secure both the jobs and the technologies of the future? And it's because if we do not give some support to that investment, you cannot create a market for energy that is fair in favor of renewables or nuclear or other parts of the energy industry. And if we do not take action with an active industrial policy, then the future for us in low carbon industries, as well as our own energy balance, is put at risk. We believe over the next 5 years we can create 400,000 jobs in low carbon technologies. That goes from the electric cars that Peter is supporting at Nissan to renewable industries, including offshore wind power, where we could be the world's, indeed we will be the world's leading offshore wind power. And then people say, well, why is government intervening and doing something in biotechnology and life sciences and medicine? Because we believe that the scope for Britain in these areas in the future is massive, and we believe the numbers of jobs in that sector will double over the next 10 years. And we believe that only by backing private enterprise, universities and research institutes with support in our science budget and also for advances in technology can we get the full fruits of the great inventive and creative spirit of Britain. And I believe in these areas of advanced manufacturing, in biotechnology, in nanotechnology, in the life sciences I've talked about, in low carbon, in all these energy industries, we have great inventive talent and skill, and our duty is to help those people who are the inventors and the entrepreneurs get the benefit from a new world market where we can lead in the niche products, the high technology goods, the high value added, the custom-built products of the future, and that's where Britain's industrial and creative future lies. I want to finish with one final example. I've had the privilege of working over the last few months with Tim Berners-Lee, to whom many attribute the invention of the internet. And I see the huge possibilities for Britain to lead in this next phase of the digital revolution. So you ask me why we are investing as a government in getting 100% high-speed, fast broadband to every area and community of the country. It's because we believe not only that it's going to be a great liberating feature of people's lives to be able to have access to the information that is available on the internet, but also because we believe hundreds and perhaps thousands of businesses can grow out of the advances that we make as a result of the digital revolution. Tim Berners-Lee has now agreed that he will head an institute that will be based here to develop the next generation of the internet. And we as a government decided in the budget to support that by an additional £30 million. And there will be a joint project between two of the great universities with many more added in so that we can lead in the next generation of the internet. And the reason why I'm excited is partly because Tim Berners-Lee has made me understand something that I wasn't really very good at understanding before, because my first experience of the internet was being in America and wanting to find the football results, and the only way I could get them was going onto the internet, and that's how I learned to do so. But what he's talking about is moving from the first generation of the internet to a new generation. He's talking about moving from the web, if you like, of linked or managing files to the web of managing data. He calls it the semantic web. And I can see the revolution that that can have that is equivalent and perhaps greater than the revolution that happened with the original internet. And if you just think what Berners-Lee achieved, almost exactly in the same way that John Silston achieved it with the discovery and then the making available the human genome, what he achieved was to make an invention available to the public in every country as a public good. And instead of there being 6 or 7 different versions of the internet competing with each other, because he refused to patent it and make it freely available to everyone, then it became a public good that all could benefit from. And that's what I believe the second generation of the internet will be like as well. Salk was the person who invented the polio vaccine in the United States of America. And when he invented that vaccine, he refused to patent it. And when he was asked why he had refused to patent it, he said, "How can you patent the sun?" Something that was so much a public good that it was quite irresponsible, he said, for him to patent something that should be widely available to all. And in the same way, Berners-Lee has said, not what's in it for him with the internet, but what's in it for us, and made it widely available to everyone in the way Sulson did with the human genome. Now, I see a great future for us in this huge area of advancing technology. I see our science benefiting right across the board from what can be done with the digital revolution. I also see a huge number of jobs for Britain in this digital future. So if you ask me, am I optimistic about the future of Britain? Can I say that there is a huge amount of possibility for progress ahead? If you ask me, can I say, how can you learn the lessons from a global financial crisis and then apply them? I say we can learn, we can change the way we do things, we can recognize that you've got to have a global financial system, we can recognize that governments have responsibilities to make sure that people are not unnecessarily thrown out of work or lose their businesses or lose their homes as a result of failures in other places. And you can also, I believe, say that Britain's inventiveness, its scientific genius, proven here 200 years ago, is going to lead the world in the future if we can work together to make the most of the creative genius in that country. Now, my message, therefore, is optimism about a great future for our country, an optimism about a future that we can achieve by working together. Thank you very much.